Good evening, and thank you for joining me. I am Kim Alexander, Executive Director of Moms of Black Boys United. I am excited today to have Jason P. Armstrong with us. He is a father, he is a husband, he is a dedicated civil servant. He has just retired after 23 years of law enforcement. He is a coach, a speaker. He wears a lot of hats. But most of all, I see Jason as a change agent and just wanting to be instrumental in how this world works from both sides, as a Black man and as a law enforcement personnel. So, Jason, thank you so much for joining me. I am
Thank you
so
for having me.
you. Yes. So we're gonna jump right into it. I gave a lot of information about you, just now, and I don't want to weigh down our time with bios and stuff because we have a lot to talk about. You
Yep.
know, you're an accomplished, man, 44 years young, already transitioning to the next phase of your life. You and I met in Florida, and I was really just impressed with your experience, how you spoke, your ability to see both sides of the coin.
Mhm.
And we know that that doesn't always happen. I want to start out, just tell me a little bit about your upbringing, what got you to want to be in law enforcement. Tell me about you.
So, I mean, my upbringing was pretty normal. I grew up with both my parents in the home and things. So,
Mhm.
I had a pretty good upbringing. Nothing real noteworthy about that. So, I was born in Jersey, grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Graduated from North Carolina Central University, the best HBCU in the land. I always got to give a shout out to my
Mhm.
Eagles at North Carolina Central. Um, so what motivated me to want to get into law enforcement? And really the only thing I can say to that is what I saw on TV, on movies and different things like that, like the cool side of things. My favorite movie growing up was the first Bad Boys movie with Martin and Will Smith. And so I saw myself as I could be a real life Mike Lowry. Was kind of my outlook on it.
I
Um,
could see that too. Now that you said it out loud, I could totally see that in you. But go ahead.
so but real talk, when I was coming up in college, I was a criminal justice major, and I wasn't interested in being a police officer. So that
Okay.
wasn't what my aim was.
Mhm.
When I looked at it, I really was interested in working at the federal level. So the
Mhm.
FBI, DEA, like one of those agencies.
Mhm.
But coming out of school, when I came out, they really didn't hire college kids straight out of college with no experience back then. So I learned about this program that the Department of Justice was funding called the Police Corps. And how it got my attention is they were flaunting $30,000 in front of your face. So if you signed up to go to this program, if you got accepted into it, you had to be a police officer for 4 years.
Mhm.
And that with the contract, you could get up to $30,000 that you had already spent on college. So it was like a reverse scholarship program. And
Mhm.
so any expense that went towards your college education. And so I got accepted into that program, and I got that $30,000. And that's what got me in the door as a police officer. Once I got in the door and started experiencing things, I saw the value that I brought to the profession just because I was different, because I was so young coming in,
Mhm.
and just I felt and saw that I had a different outlook and a different approach to what policing looked like. And then I started getting promoted. And then, I started to have some success with navigating different things,
Mhm.
from a supervisor, getting a little bit more authority and having, a little bit more bandwidth to impact things and to work with people and to educate people. And that really, just fueled ultimately what became my passion for trying to drive the change that I think a lot of us want to see in law enforcement.
A lot of people would say Black in the PD, right? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? It is, I don't know that I would tell my sons to do it, just with the world the way that it is. What was it like 23 years ago to be young, black, driven, knowing you wanted the change and be in Georgia?
So I would say when I first started, I didn't know I wanted to be the change.
Okay.
I was too young, I was too immature to see life like that.
Hmm.
So for me starting out, it was just about like the fun side of policing. Like, I love to chase down bad guys and just all the ripping and running, chasing drugs and all of that stuff. That was the exciting part. That was the fun part.
Okay.
It wasn't until I got a little bit further along in my career where I had experienced enough things to
Hmm.
really start to learn and to get my footing. And so one thing that wasn't a part of the conversation 23 years ago when I first started was, a lot of talk about bias in law enforcement or bias in people, period. Bias exists everywhere in our society,
Hmm.
but we didn't talk a lot about it. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is my experience with bias early on as a young officer and how I approached it early on versus how I approached it once I started to mature myself. When I first started working like undercover details and things like that, like, like I said, the fun stuff, they don't give you a clothing allowance or a budget to go buy clothes to work undercover. So you come in whatever clothes you have in your closet. And so
Okay.
me, that's me coming in my regular clothes that I wore, when I wasn't at work.
Okay.
So, that might be a hoodie that's going, some jeans, some Jordans on. Like that's how I dress. That's how I dress to this day. That's me. And when I would walk into the building and I would go behind our security door, I would get hit with the comments.
Mm.
Who let the thug in here? Who let how did the hoodlum get past security? Like some of those comments where there was nothing wrong with them. Like, in the police department, we crack on each other, we joke on each other. It's just nonstop, getting on one another, and that's all that it was. But as I matured, I started thinking about it a little bit more. And okay, if that's the first thought that pops up into my colleagues' mind when they see me, a young black male dressed like this, now they're just joking with me. But if they see somebody out on the streets that they don't know, I'm pretty sure that same thought is the first thing that pops up in their mind. And so, as I matured in the profession, I started learning and understanding how, really it was my responsibility because it wasn't a lot of us in the department, or it
Mhm.
wasn't a lot of young black males in the department that had that outlook that, that could connect with the people in the community like I could, and had a role and responsibility inside the police department to try to help educate them on, all right, just because somebody looks like this doesn't mean X, Y, and Z. And I'm a little bit confrontational at times. And so, I was talking some junk and some smack and you know, well, who let the hoodlum in here? I'm like, well, this hoodlum is smarter than all of you all in here, or I'm more educated than all, or just whatever the comeback may be. And
Mhm.
it went from those kind of comebacks to, okay, I need to do a better job of help educate these people because they weren't bad people. They're not racist or any of that stuff. That is just inherently, the biases and the stereotypes that live in all of us. And
Mhm.
that was one, that played out for me early in my career.
So I always say there's truth and jest. So, a lot of times we hide feelings, all kinds of feelings, good ones, bad ones, inside of jokes. And I hear the statement you just made a lot. They're not racist. Um, but the truth of the matter is, and we've talked about this before, the difference between me and a police officer is that police officer has the authority to take life and liberty in 2.2 seconds. That's the difference between me and the officer. And so when I come into a situation with bias, which I own that, like you said, we all have that. When I come into that situation, my reaction is going to be different than what an officer's reaction can potentially be. We all have a responsibility to address that, but don't you feel like police officers who have such authority to change the scope of one's life have a greater authority to do better?
Absolutely. Yeah, 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 absolutely. And that's one of the things that really contributed to the work that I did in the profession and the reforms that I led, especially in the agencies that I led as chief,
Mhm,
and the work that I do now because I've had my career and I have results that I can put on the table of
mhm,
when you are committed to this work. And when we talk about bridge building and breaking down barriers to police and community dynamics, and I can show you what that looks like, and I can show you how you get results in some of the toughest places to do that kind of work. It highlights, why the responsibility falls to us. And one of my training classes,
mhm.
there's a image that I use, and it's from a protest, and a young man is holding up a sign that says, "You have the power, be the change." And that's the title of one of my keynote addresses, to
Mhm.
where I'm talking about, just the responsibility that we have, because in this dynamic, we are the power dynamic, or law enforcement is the power dynamic.
Right.
Now, I also talk about this with community groups and different things to help them understand the power that they have in that space and how they can use it. Because take, Apex, where I just retired from. I was authorized for 112 police officers
Mhm.
at that agency. The population is 80,000 people.
Mhm.
80,000 against 112. Who
Mhm.
really has the power? It's the 80,000. But the outlook of that dynamic is that, hell, just one of the 112 has all of the power in
Mhm.
that dynamic. And so, I understand why and how people look at it that way. And you're absolutely right. We take an oath, to do this job and to do the work, and the authority that comes along with that. That's why I'm always advocating, to law enforcement, that we have to lead that effort in what, bridge building or reconciliation or wherever we are in the dynamic with the community. It starts with us.
So I started out by saying that you're a parent. You have an 18-year-old son,
Hmm.
right? And you also have a 10-year-old, but the 18-year-old male child in particular.
Hmm.
Um, I know when my children, my sons started driving, there's a particular feeling that comes over us. And this podcast is called The New Talk. We're changing how we're talking,
Hmm.
but we know what it looks like inside of our households when we're sitting down with our male Black children and
Hmm.
having those kinds of conversations. How did, if it did, how did the way that you police, the way that you approach situations, how did the way that you approached fatherhood change with your son?
It didn't, I wouldn't say it changed. I would say, having a family just added an additional layer of accountability
Mhm,
on me, and how I led, especially as a police chief. I led from the lens that, the decisions that I have to make, and the things that I have to do, am I comfortable when I walk through the door at the end of the day? And I'm looking at the three people that matter the most to me,
mhm,
and would they be proud of me and how I handled whatever challenges I was facing that day? And that is really, what fueled how I tried to show up for the community. Because if I can make these three human beings proud and happy to say publicly that that's my husband right there, that's my father right there, then I know I'm doing the absolute best and the most that I can do for the community. And with my son in particular, when
mhm,
we talk about the talk, and most Black families are very well versed and familiar with it.
mhm,
All right. And it was no different in my household. Like, I had to talk to my son about the exact same things. I still talk to him about those things, although he's been driving for a couple of years, and just always giving scenarios to him. What would you do in this situation? What would you do with this? What would you do with that? And staying on him constantly to make sure that he is always thinking about those things, because young people do what young people do,
mhm,
and young people make dumb decisions. Like,
mhm,
that is the epitome of being a young person. We
mhm.
all did it. And
I'm
so,
gonna need you to speak for yourself, but go ahead.
Tim, don't even try to play me like that. You right there along with me. And so it's trying to equip them
Mm,
with, and not just lecturing to them,
mhm, mhm,
but having a dialogue where you can see how their brain processes decisions, and throwing different things at them. So not just saying, hey, if this happened, this is what you do. Asking questions and having a dialogue with them of, how do what do you envision, what do you think you would do in this scenario?
mhm,
Okay, now add another variable to it. What would you do in this scenario?
mhm,
And so, like my son knows all of the right things to say. He's not going to say the wrong thing to his dad, the police chief.
mhm,
But I can try to help break it down for him, where it's like, it's easy to say that, and I know you're saying what I want to hear.
mhm,
But dude, this is what I need you to be thinking about, and this is how challenging it is. And let me give you examples of, man, I've seen a lot of good kids get caught up in some nightmare situations because they panic, and their auto default is to the wrong decision.
right.
And just trying to help my son understand that, dude, you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to make the wrong decision at times, man. You're going to do some things to get in trouble. Like, it's okay, man. I'm still going to be here. Hey, I just need to make sure that you make it back to me so we can handle whatever it is that we got to handle. And whether, the more consequences are going to be with me or whoever it is that you're dealing with, we'll get through all of that stuff. I can't have a horrible split-second decision leading to consequences that we can't recover from.
Amen. I hear you. So, conversely, how did you, as a leader, teach your officers to show grace as law enforcement personnel?
At the end of the day, is what you model. When you're the police chief, when you're the head, people are looking at you, for how you carry yourself, and that is a sign or a symbol of how your organization is going to carry itself. So, for me, in the gray space, it really has to deal with what you praise, in the work that you do. One thing I talk about a great deal: when I started in the profession, the only feedback that we got, was every month they would post up in our meeting room, statistics, and those statistics largely were how many arrests, each officer made, or how many tickets each officer wrote, and that was the measuring stick
Mm,
for how good an officer you were, or how well you did your job or whatnot, because those were the only numbers that we were pulling from. One of the things that I implemented as a chief was building out a community policing platform
mhm,
where we could attach numbers to community policing efforts.
mhm,
And what are we doing in that space, to where, all right, if I have an officer that, depending on what part of town they're working in, that may drive, or that is going to drive what challenges they face,
mhm.
or what their
Right.
daily activities may be. And so you may be in a space where traffic enforcement is what you're spending most of your day doing,
Mhm,
because of the area that you're assigned to. And so your traffic enforcement may be all the way up here, and
mhm,
your community outreach engagement may be different because it's driven by where you are.
mhm.
Okay, that's fine. But then I could have an officer in another part of town where it's the complete opposite. And
Right.
before, we didn't have a good mechanism to track that.
Mhm,
One of the things that I did in agencies that I led was to build that in, because if both officers are doing what we expect them to do, and they are following the mission and the values of our organization, but it just shows up differently, I want both of them to get equal credit for the work that they're doing, if they're contributing to something positive for our organization and for the community, and what the community is expecting to see. And so building out different ways and different things that we could do to highlight what good policing looks like,
mhm, mhm,
where, all right, I don't care how many tickets you write or how many people you arrest. I care about the impact that you have. More
mhm.
specifically, I care about the positive impact that you have. And so it wasn't a rare occurrence for a community member to email me
Mhm,
to tell me what a good job one of my officers did, or how they had a pleasant experience with one of my officers. And sometimes, like, it could even been, somebody that went to jail or somebody that got a ticket, but they appreciated how they were treated and valued in that moment. And
Mhm.
and whenever one of those would come in, we have a software system where we could load information into.
Mhm.
And I would always personally, if it came to me, I would always personally load it in and send a little note and message to the officer thanking them for being a good representative of our organization. And so it's little things like that that
Mhm.
leaders can do when, whatever your value is, that you can reinforce what those values are and how they show up daily between the people that you lead.
Before we move on and talk specifically about some of the agencies that you worked for, I want to ask, we talked a lot about at the conference that you and I met at, we talked a lot about how we find people who are going to work for the agency, whatever respective agency that is. How do you determine whether or not an individual is going to be a value add?
So that's not a decision that I solely make. Um,
Okay.
so it's a team effort. So one, I would say, so it starts with who is in your recruiting unit or division, or who holds that primary responsibility. And so some of the work that goes into that is, so I've always, outside of the short stint at my first agency when I was the interim chief for a little while, I've always been hired from the outside into an agency to take over and lead an agency as the chief.
Mhm.
And so coming in, one of the things that I'm looking at is how do we recruit, and what is our process like in this space? Because what I'm looking for is I'm looking for gaps that contribute to unintended consequences
Mhm.
or disparities in how people can join our agency.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I'm looking at is our process. What are we asking people to go through? Does it make sense what we're asking people to go through? What we're asking people to go through, is it negatively impacting some people that it shouldn't? And if so, why is that? And how can we fix that? And what can we do to change that? And then also looking at our policies. And one thing that I got a lot of praise for, but also caught a lot of heat for,
Mhm.
was changing our appearance policy.
Okay.
Law enforcement has always had a very strict appearance policy.
Mhm.
And if we're being real about it, all right, when law enforcement first started, nobody that looked like me and you was in any kind of decision making seat.
Mhm.
And so the origins of a lot of this stuff is very dimensional
Mhm.
on the individuals that were at the table when the quote unquote professional look for law enforcement was created. And that's what has been modeled generations and generations and generations. And we see a lot of that changing today. And that was one of the things that, I was happy to get on board with trying to change, where, when I do consulting work on this topic right here, what I tell agency leaders to do, I tell them, go drive around your community, go drive around and look at all the people that you see outside. So drive around for an hour, come back. Now open up your policy manual and look at your appearance policy and tell me how many people could not work for your police department that you saw out in your community because they don't look professional.
Mhm.
Whether it's their hair and what color or hairstyle it is.
Mhm.
We know for black and brown, women in particular, the Crown Act and all of the challenges and fights that have gone along with that, to where, male officers, it was always clean shaven and your hair had to be, a certain kind of way and all of those things. And we see a lot of those things fallen by the wayside. You see, I have tattoos,
Mhm.
and there was a point where you couldn't have any exposed tattoos. Everything had to be covered up, and just all of those things where, in the agencies that I've led and some of the policy changes, I have male officers that can wear earrings if they
Mhm.
choose to wear earrings in uniform, because I don't differentiate between male, female when it comes to the earring policy.
Mhm.
This is our earring policy, period.
Mhm.
And it, it's not gender specific. So
Mhm.
doing things like that, to where my outlook on it is people in the community when they see our officers, man, I want them to see a rainbow, if you will, a wide array of diversity in what we look like, because I'm hoping that they can see themselves represented in one of my officers. And that's just one step closer to them feeling a connection to our agency, to our department, and hopefully to law enforcement, to where even though their mom or their dad may not want them to be in this profession, they
Mhm.
saw something that just like, I see myself in that person right there.
Mhm.
And that's part of what goes into, overcoming the challenges that we see right now, because recruiting is at an all-time low in law enforcement nationally, nationwide. It is tough, and the shortages that we see are problematic, and we have to get creative with how we're going after people and how we're targeting people to encourage them to get in this profession. And everything doesn't come down to money, because we see, I know some departments that are throwing $50,000 signing bonuses to people, and they still can't find enough officers, because the workforce is different today than what it was when I first came into it.
Absolutely is different. And I think our world is different as well. Our US is different. Um, it's different in the sense that the things that used to be backdoor now out front in a lot of different situations. I
Hmm.
um but you talked a lot about how recruits would adjust to what you're giving them. How do you address what they have been through? So it's what they're getting into, but what have they come out of? And what I mean by that is um, there are a lot of stressors that exist with the responsibility of being a law enforcement officer.
Hmm.
How do you examine one's readiness emotionally, psychologically for something like that? Like if I pull up a listing right now for the FBI, they gonna know, which way I laid in utero before I get a chance to be part of the agency. Same for CIA. I think the difference between those federal agencies and local agencies are, like you said, you had 112 officers to 80,000 people. Some agencies is literally a sheriff and a sheriff's deputy. Um, it's vast.
Hmm.
How do we account for that gap when the pool is dry? We need officers. We're dealing with nepotism, and we're dealing with this wide array of policies and rules that differ from how federal agencies do it.
One of the biggest talking points nationally are consistency in the standards of law enforcement.
Mhm.
And I'll tell people all the time, like, you're never going to see it mandated. It is never going to be mandated, because there are so many differences in, one, what resources agencies have,
Mhm.
and two, our communities are vastly different. And that's part of the challenge that any system faces if they are trying to make something mandatory straight across the board. Because in our profession, it comes down to what we call unfunded mandates. And I've been involved in a lot of conversations at the state level, because that's what drives law enforcement. It's not the federal government; it's the
Mhm.
state level, and what laws and things are put into place by your General Assembly. And I've sit on boards and different things for chiefs associations and whatnot. And when we're talking through a lot of things, that is always the roadblock that comes up for some of the things that we're talking about, is things that are unfunded mandates,
Mhm.
because there are so many agencies that do not have the funding and the resources to do a lot of these things.
Mhm.
Now, to the first part of your question, as far as, how do we test officers or make sure that they're ready?
Mhm.
So, I've had the luxury of working at agencies that had very robust background processes
Mhm.
that included going to talk to psychologist, having a psychologist go through a session and test you for the things that we're talking about. Is
Mhm.
is this person, sound and mentally fit
Mhm.
for the demands of being a police officer as best as they can test somebody. Like, I mean, there is no 100% exact
Mhm.
science, um, but having the psychological testing done, there's physical fitness testing that is done, there's health screening that is done, of course there's drug screenings,
Mhm.
that is done, and there's looking at the person's history and their background. To your point, what have they been through, and how does that match here? But this is and I'm not here to interview you, but
Mhm.
I love when I'm talking to people that's not in law enforcement, because I'm able to share some of the challenges that go into that space. Because let me tell you what some of my challenges were as a police chief,
Mhm.
where when we look at the statistics and we look at the numbers, and so we know the disparities and the percentages of minorities, and what they have been through and what they have experienced. And
Mhm.
when we look at the criminal justice system, the numbers are what they are. And so the likelihood of an applicant coming to me that is a minority and having some blemishes on in their background,
Mhm.
on their criminal history, is the percentages or the probabilities are going to be higher
Mhm.
than non-minorities. Would you
Okay.
agree with that? Right.
Yes.
And so, but then there's also an expectation from the community, especially when you look at the department, and if it's not representative of the community that they're policing, is, all right, chief, you need more minorities on your police force, and we need to see better representation and what your officers look like, because that's going to make us feel more comfortable in things.
Mhm.
And so there is no perfect line and balance in all of those things, to where, you know what constitutes somebody being the perfect, or the right, yeah, I don't want to say perfect, being the ideal candidate for a second chance, versus, oh no, this individual absolutely doesn't deserve a second chance, or doesn't deserve the opportunity to be in this profession. Because that's always the first go to. Like, so if somebody does something bad, all the open records requests come out, and then we start looking at the history. It's like, oh, we should have known this person, did this, and this. But you talked about grace earlier.
Mhm.
I told you I lead with grace. And
Mhm.
that was one of the things that I was always looking to do, because I've seen the opposite of it. I've seen people who should have been given a chance at this profession, and they had the door shut in their face.
Mhm.
Whereas when I saw those things coming up, and especially when I saw the disparity and how minorities had those doors closed when other people didn't have those doors closed, and hell, what I'm looking at and their background is worse than this individual over here. That's part of when you're inside the profession or whatever it may be. That's how you can drive change. And so when I get in a position to be able to help people, I'm still going to do my due diligence. And so I'm not signing up for somebody that I don't feel is a
Mhm.
good fit and shouldn't be here. But I'm also going to create opportunities for people that I strongly feel deserve that grace and deserve those opportunities. And it's one of the things where, as a chief, when you make those decisions, like, all right, man, your career could
Mhm.
ride on that decision, and you have to be okay with that. Because if you're not, then what the hell did you fight, scratch and claw to get to the seat in the first place?
Right, right, right.
And so there's a delicate balance that goes into that. And that's where just having the standards, unilateral uniform standards, we'll never see that in local law enforcement. That's always going to be state driven. Well, I shouldn't say never, but it is highly unlikely, because there's so many nuances that go into it.
All right. So we kind of talked a lot about different agencies. I think, in my opinion, reading your background, one of the pivotal times in your life would be when you chose to be police chief in Ferguson, Missouri, following Mike Brown's murder. And when I first read that, when you first said it, I was like, oh, like, how did you get there? And why would you get there? What was the impetus to be the person that came behind that and all that that community was feeling and hurting. And so Michael Brown was 18 in 2014 when he was killed, and you took over as police chief in 2019, correct?
Yes.
And that was 3 years after the consent decree. Now, before we get into all of that, explain for our audience what a consent decree is.
So when it comes to law enforcement, a consent decree is a an agreement that is, it's almost like a lawsuit is kind of the best way that I can describe it. It's almost like a lawsuit. So it's a court order that is overseen by a federal judge. So the Department of Justice comes into a police department or a public safety department. They do an investigation, and if they find patterns or practices of unconstitutional policing and problematic policing, then they come back with all of these recommendations that they want to go into a consent decree where the Department of Justice signs it, the agency or the city that is under investigation, they sign it, and it just lays out all of the mandates and the reforms that have to be implemented by the police department to be in good standing with the court and with the federal judge that's overseeing the consent decree.
Now, how thick was Ferguson's consent decree?
469 paragraphs long.
Wow. So there was a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first learned about the consent decree, I found it really interesting because it had been deemed that law enforcement did nothing wrong. It had been deemed that there were no um, civil rights violated. None of this stuff, like there was no,
When you say it had been deemed, like it
like
had been
there,
deemed by who?
there was no, nobody was convicted of killing Michael Brown.
Correct. So let me add to that. Yeah, because the Mike Brown incident was never ruled a murder,
Mhm.
and it was never ruled a criminal act. So when it comes to a consent decree, and and this is what I do a lot of teaching to law enforcement
Mhm.
agencies about it. So the Mike Brown incident was the catalyst that got the Department of Justice into Ferguson to do an investigation.
Okay.
Now, when they do an investigation, they're not just looking at that one incident.
Mhm.
They're looking under every nook and cranny of your organization to
Mhm.
see if anything is wrong.
Okay.
And so when you read through the first, so they put out a report of their findings from their patterns of practice investigation. So that highlights the problematic things that they found and that they uncovered. And then that's what fuels what all goes into the consent decree. So the consent decree document itself and all of the work that's going on in Ferguson and when it comes to reforms and stuff, it's not specific to the Mike Brown incident.
Mhm.
Like I said, that shooting was investigated by multiple entities,
Mhm.
and nobody ever ruled it an unjustified shooting or a criminal shooting, and that includes the FBI when they investigated that incident.
Do you
Uh,
agree with that?
so I haven't seen it, and it's nothing for me to see or the evidence of it. When I talk about that case, when I talk about that incident, one, I wasn't there, and there's no video of it or anything like that. So the only thing that we have are witness accounts. And in reading through all of the investigations that were done on it, and from the witness accounts, I understand how it's ruled a justified shooting when you look at the legalities that go into an officer being able to use deadly force in a situation. Now, if I was the officer that was there that day, do I think that I would have shot and killed that young man? No, I do not. And that's the best that I can throw at it. But reading everything that I've read on it, and witness accounts, yeah, I understand that it was ruled a justified shooting with the evidence that they have for that case and knowing how our legal system works. Um, but is that doesn't minimize how tragic it is. That doesn't minimize, just the pain and the agony of parents losing an 18-year-old child.
Mhm.
And like you said earlier, I have an 18-year-old child, and so I definitely understand, just how challenging and just tragic that is, for a family and for a community. But when it comes to the consent decree is not specific to that incident. The decree was, they looked at years and years and years worth of data, reports, talking to community members about specific incidents and different things. And it's the totality of everything is what leads to the document.
What made you apply to that position?
All right. So clearly you haven't read my book yet.
I
Not
have
that
not.
part in the book.
Mm-mm.
So
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
I did it as a joke to myself. Real talk. I cannot make this up. So here's the thing about my career. So I was a captain. So I
Mhm,
was in management,
mhm,
part of the command staff in 2014 when Mike Brown was killed.
mhm,
And watching that whole event unfold, watching the aftermath and the rioting and the destruction, just I watched all of it. And I stayed connected to everything that was going on up there. When
mhm,
the DOJ report came out months later, I read the report. And in reading that report, I saw a lot of similarities in Ferguson and in Forest Park, where I was currently working.
mhm,
And I was the only minority on our command staff.
mm,
And so when I looked around, I'm like, all right, if we're going to change, if we're going to do something different, I'm the person that's uniquely positioned to lead those efforts, because we had a predominantly minority community at my department in Georgia.
mhm,
And the same way that people were talking about the Ferguson Police Department, from what I read in that report, I knew people in Forest Park talked about us the same way.
mhm,
And so I made it a personal responsibility of mine to be that change and to try to lead some of those efforts, so we could show up better for the community. Because if we had a controversial shooting, whether it was justified or unjustified, the last thing I wanted is for my community to experience what they experienced in Ferguson. So that was a pivotal moment in my career, because that really was the catalyst that really got me going in a lot of the community work that I did. So fast forward, what, 4 years or
mhm,
so after that, and I'm looking at chief jobs around the country, and I'm on the site, the chief's website, and I see Ferguson there, and I'm like, dang, like that's Ferguson. Click on to read it. So I'm just reading it just for entertainment purposes only. And I read through it, and the only reason I applied for the job is because the only thing that they were asking for in the initial submission was a cover letter and a resume. That's it. And I had those ready to go.
mhm,
So I'm like, shoot, man, I got that. Why
mhm.
not? And so I updated my cover letter real quick, put Ferguson in all the spots that I needed to say Ferguson, and I fired it off. And I promised, like, I hit submit, and I am laughing to myself, like, Jason, like, you're stupid, man. You just applied to be the police chief in Ferguson, Missouri. And so a couple months later, or however long later, I don't even remember, I got a phone call about coming to interview. And I'm like, okay, like I didn't see this coming. But once again, I'm like, all right, all these processes, you want to have a decent amount of people interview. So I'm like, there's no way I'm in serious contention for this job. This is Ferguson of all places.
Mhm,
And I had been a police chief, like interim police chief, for a few months. So that
mhm,
was all the police chief experience that I had. So I'm like, they would never entertain me for this job. But I was like, this would be a good experience for me,
mhm,
because when we talk about a scrutinized process, I couldn't
mhm,
imagine any police chief process being more scrutinized than this one. And so I'm like, if I go up there and participate in this process, I know I don't stand a chance of getting the job, but man, it will be very valuable, and I should get a lot of positive insights that will help me for other chief processes that I would, that ultimately I will go on.
mhm,
So I got up there, and I the first night that I got up there, I went to the council meeting, and so
mhm,
I snuck in. I'm sitting in the back. Don't nobody know who I am,
mhm.
and I hear, where I learn, I should say, that uh, several of the candidates had dropped out of the process,
Wow.
and so I'm like, shoot, it's just me and the internal candidate.
Wow.
And so now once I learned that bit of information, that changed my whole outlook and my whole dynamic.
And
Uh,
you didn't go home?
mm, no.
So what made you say yes?
So initially I said no.
Okay.
Yeah. so here's the thing. So once I learned that, so before the process started, I'm like, all right, man, now I have a real chance.
Mhm.
And so that changed my whole mindset. Now I went into the process like, all right, there's nothing that can stop me. And like when I have that mindset on something, like it's legit. Like there is nothing that can stop me. I feel that confident in
Mhm.
myself. So I go through the process, and leaving Ferguson when I was going back home to Atlanta, you couldn't tell me that I had not, won that process or come out on top of that process. Like I felt that strong. So telling my wife, hey, you need to start thinking about this. They're about to offer me this job. And my wife she wanted no parts of processing leaving Atlanta. It wasn't about going to Ferguson, it was about leaving Atlanta
Okay.
until it was 100% okay, this is on the table and we have to talk through this. So we started scheduling meetings. Like, hey, we need to meet with our pastor on Sunday. Like I started doing, got a whole bunch of things in motion before I ever got the phone call because I knew I was going to get the phone call. And so the following week, the phone call came and they offered me the job. And so now me and my wife finally, you can't run from this anymore. We have to sit down and have this conversation. So we have the conversation, and verbally, my wife says, yes, I support this. Let's go. But we all know that nonverbal communication makes up the majority of what we're communicating. And non-verbally, she was saying, hell no, I'm not on board with this. And I do not support this. And I'm not leaving Atlanta to go there.
I'm with Selena, but go ahead.
So, so we had that conversation. So it ends. So the next morning, although she said yes, the next morning I called the city manager back and I turned the job down and tell him
Mhm.
that I'm not coming.
Mhm.
And so when he asked me why, and I told him, I said, my wife is not where I need her to be for me to be able to take this job and to do this. I said, because I know it's going to be hell on me. And
Mm.
I know, that this is what feels like an insurmountable task. The
Mm.
only way I survive this, the only way my family survives this are the people that have to support me and need to support me.
Mm.
They are whole, so they can support me how I'm going to need to be supported.
Mm.
And as distraught as she was at the notion of leaving, I didn't feel as though she could support me how I needed to be supported. And so,
Mm.
so I was going to fail, and family was going to fail, and I couldn't have that, so I turned it down.
Mhm.
So, but they end up, he called me back a little while later and invited to bring my wife up there for her to see the community and to meet some people and just get more information before we made a final decision. And so that helped with both of our processing everything. And then when we just looked at how everything fell in place for us to end up in that, at that point in our life where we have that decision to make, we just strongly felt that the only answer to that was that, God had this was God's path for us. And that's not something that we can say no to. And ultimately that's how we got to our yes.
Okay. So you said that you learned that a lot of people have fallen off out of the contention for the chief position, and you had less than a year experience as an interim chief. Did that worry you?
When you take the Ferguson chief job, you worry, period. Hell, it don't matter how long you've been a damn chief. Your ass, if you ain't worried, then something wrong with you. Here was my take on it though, is I strongly felt, as young as I was,
Mm.
and the energy and the passion and all of the vigor that I had in me, I strongly felt that that was what was going to get me through it.
Mhm.
And that was going to be, my biggest benefit, because I looked at things differently. I was 39 years old when I got the Ferguson job. So hell, one of the youngest chiefs in the country,
Mm.
especially to be leading such a noteworthy police department.
You
And
didn't even have your chief belly yet, you know?
and
That
I never got one either. I never got one either. And hey, yeah, I had to make sure that I tried to keep it as tight as I could keep it. I never wanted to not look, squared away in my uniform and presence and all of that stuff. Um, so yeah, that was, I knew I was inexperienced,
Mhm,
but I was really looking at that to be a positive for me. And still being a young male, a young black male going into a predominantly black community,
mhm,
I was really counting on my youth to be a positive for me, and being able to connect with people and have conversations with people out in the community, to where they could relate to me, not me as the police chief, just me as Jason Armstrong.
mhm.
And I intentionally showed up that way. um and that, I have to believe that that was one of the things that helped, with some of the success that I had up there.
That's success. You chronicle it in your book.
Hmm.
I just got my copy right before I travel, so I'm excited to pick it up and read it. Um, but that's what it's all about. Like, so we've talked about you retiring, but what it's really been for you is a transition
Hmm.
and going from being the change on the inside to being the change on the outside, and new work and just building up communities. Tell us what the next couple years look like for you, what you're hoping for, what brought you to the point that you wanted to put all of this information in your book, where we can get it, where we can learn more, where we can book you. Tell us all the good stuff.
So I would say what really drove my decision to retire early, essentially, and to transition over onto the side that I'm on now, was I really felt called and passionate that, with the success that I've had in communities and in police departments, that if I can take my approach and my framework for how you lead law enforcement and how law enforcement partners with the community, and do that work in as many communities as will have me,
Mhm,
then we'll see better results around the country. We'll see better results around the world, um, when we look at law enforcement, what law enforcement means. So over the next 3 years, a goal of mine is to deliver, one of my trainings or one of my speaking engagements or topics in all 50 states.
okay.
I want to touch all 50 states in the next 3 years, and bringing my work to really lay the foundation for people seeing the value and how we can show up differently and how we can show up better in the
Mhm,
communities that we serve. A lot of people talk about impact and being change agents and all of that stuff. If the word positive is not in front of that, then all right, what are we really doing? And so last year I did President Obama's US Leaders Program. It was the first cohort of the Obama Foundation's US Leaders Program.
mhm,
And so I was with 99 other leaders, from around the country and in our territories. And I was the only police chief in the group, and there was only one other person from law enforcement that was a part of the 100. So 2 out of 100 worked in law enforcement. So I'm with people from just various different backgrounds and experiences. I'm with a lot of people from, that work in advocacy or activism for different areas, and different things. And I'm in a room with a lot of people that look at police like, man, what the hell he doing here? And I love being in those spaces. And so that really fueled for me, just wrestling with the idea that, Jason, you could have just an amazing impact
mm,
if you didn't have to pour all of your effort and energy into one community.
mm,
If I was to create my own lane where I can pour all of that effort and energy into various communities around the country and ultimately around the world, how big of a positive impact could I make on society and humanity
Mhm.
in doing the work that I've done? And so in writing the book, I'm done here. And I always have to tell people, the title, it has a catchy title. And when you work with a publisher, you got to get a title that, gets people attention and all of that stuff. But it's not about like quitting law
Mhm.
enforcement or retiring from law enforcement, or it's not a book telling people, stop what you're doing. But
Mhm.
it's really about just analyzing whatever space we're in, especially if you're in a leadership position.
Mhm.
You are in a borrowed seat,
Mm.
period.
Mm.
And I don't care if you started the company.
Mm.
If you're in a leadership position, you're in a borrowed seat. Now, that borrowed seat could be for a very short period of time. It could be for a very long period of time,
Mhm.
right? But it's going to come to an end at some point.
Mhm.
At some point, you're going to be done there.
Mhm.
Whether you make that decision for yourself or whether somebody makes that decision for you.
Mhm.
But whenever that time comes,
But did you leave?
when we look back, so once you say, I'm done here, when you look back on what you contributed to that space, what
Mhm.
did you do? What impact did you have? Did you make the space better than you found it? Or did you change what needed to be changed? Or did you try to change what needed to be changed? And
Mhm.
and that's really when we look at this work, or when I look at this work and the impact that I'm looking to have, now that I have the freedom and the flexibility to just go all over the place and work with agencies and work with leaders and work with community members and community groups on how we can do this better and put results on the table
Mhm.
and show them, all right, I did this in Ferguson. Now, I'm not sugarcoating, like Ferguson was hell, and I made a lot of mistakes and a lot of things, and you know, man, I have to live with everything that happened there. But we did a lot of good and we made a lot of progress, and that's what I'm most proud of there. The same with the work that I did in Apex, coming here with the challenges that were waiting for me here,
Mhm.
and what I was brought in to address and to lead the change and the reforms on. I'm not always the most popular person in my agency because I just that's just the hand that I was dealt, where I took chief jobs where I was being brought in to lead change and to lead reforms because there was something that was there, that was present, that was problematic. And just the things that I do are not conventional to law enforcement, but once again, I can put results on the table and highlight and show with doing it my way of how it can help you better connect with the community that you serve.
So you said results a lot of times. Tell me what results mean because, I'm a nurse, so results mean blood work. Tell me what results for you means. What have you
So
experienced? What are
I,
you
I,
doing?
I'll give you a quick taste of a case study that I talk about in one of my training classes. The work that I did in Apex specifically,
Mhm.
and coming into Apex on the heels of a cultural assessment report that had been done on the police department, and
Mhm.
it went public, and all of the headlines read racial bias and blind spots deeply entrenched in the Apex police culture.
Mm.
And that's what the report highlighted. So that's what I got hired into.
Mm.
So coming in as the first Black chief that the city of Apex had ever had,
Mhm.
on the heels of a cultural assessment report that goes public saying that you have these racial bias problems, you see the dynamic that I walk into.
Mhm.
And a lot of people looking at it is like, damn, they had to go get the chief from Ferguson to come down here. Like, is that bad down
Mhm.
here? Or of course they hired a Black chief
Mhm.
because of this. So it's a lot of the things that you have to navigate being a minority in law enforcement, especially when you get some of the positions that I've had.
Mhm.
But because of the assessment and some of the challenges that came from that, a community group started up locally
Mhm. Mhm.
in Apex, and they were just a group of advocates, activists, whatever you want to label them.
Mhm.
Is they wanted to see things change, and they wanted the police department to be held accountable, or they wanted the officers and the staff to be accountable to the community and all of those things. And so when I talk about results, I always laugh about my first meeting with some of the members of this group and just how much hell they were giving me. Because I had been there for maybe a month before I'm sitting in front of them, and it's like, you haven't done this, you haven't done this, you haven't done that, and but you ain't worth a damn, and all of this stuff, and that's the energy that you get from people, and it's like, people, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. Like,
I'm seeing Joe Clark's community meeting in my head.
Exactly. So, it's like, give me some time, and don't worry, I'm not going on this journey by myself. I'm bringing you all with me. And so being intentional about bringing them in to work with me on things and to partner with me on things. And I'm changing my whole office of professional standards. And so I'm creating a new position, and I need to hire somebody. I need one of you all to come sit on my board so you can help me vet the people that I'm looking to bring in for this. Like little things like that, and being consistent. Now let's have some meetings so I can give you updates on what it is that we're doing and what I do and how I lead a police department, to where you fast forward 3 years of doing that work. And when my retirement announcement went out, one of the first text messages I got was from one of their members, and it said, "Who do I need to come down there and beat up?" I'm like, you don't need to beat up anybody. Like, this is just where I'm at in life. Then the next message was, is this going to change all of the work that we've done? And so now these are people that couldn't stand my ass when I first walked through the door because they didn't feel as though things were moving fast enough. But when you're committed to the work and you're intentional about it, that's why in my title, Create Lasting Impact by Leading with Intentionality. When you're intentional about it, like, those are the results that you can have. Because when you get that from the community, especially, people who, if you were doing something bad, are going to be your loudest critics and naysayers, and you can get them to buy into what it is that you're doing, that's invaluable.
Right.
And so when I talk about results, like, those are the things that I'm talking about. Those are the receipts that I can show. And I can, when I do my class, I show the text message. I'm not making this up. Here's the text message that I got. Here are notes that they sent us after some of the work. And this is where it started. So I highlight all of the stuff that was on the front end of that. And then I get to the results at the end. And so, my method of doing things is tried and tested, and there are results that go along with it. So that's what I travel around the world, educating law enforcement, educating communities on how you can work together to see ultimately, like I said, what we all want to see. And none of us want to see the Sonya Masseys and the George Floyds and just name after name, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, all of the names that we know. Our communities don't want to see that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Amen.
But at the same token, from the law enforcement side, we want to see all these officers getting attacked and killed like we do. Officer Brown down in Texas last month, he pulled into the parking lot of a community center just to be present. And the guy walks up to him and assassinates him in his police car for the sole reason that he was sitting there in a police uniform in a police car. Another black man taken from us.
Yeah, we want everybody to come home.
Exactly.
Everybody deserves to come home, and we want to work together. And that is the loudest message that I hope that people get from this podcast, is that the conversations can happen. We can ask the hard questions. We can have the hard conversations. The key is to be at the table.
And be at the table and be intentional about being at the table.
And consistent, because the consistency matters. You got to show up. You can't have questions. You can't question and not be part of the committee that's showing up to push things forward. So I'm done here. Was released. It's been a couple of weeks now, right?
Yes, it's 1 month today. It came out November 1st. So out of my book, I'm done here. If you go to my website, jasonparmstrong.com, That's where you can learn more about me. You can order the book right off of my website. That's where you can see some of the topics that I speak on, or some of the consulting work that I do in this space. And that's also how you can get in contact with me. You can also follow me on social media. Jason P. Armstrong is my handle on all of the sites: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, X is where you can find me.
And I want to reiterate that this book is not just for law enforcement. I have my copy. As a leader, I am excited to get into it. You're going to get some emails and text messages from me. We're going to talk about it, because it really is, what you see is what you get. Jason is true to form in his willingness and his want to truly bring positive change, as he put it, to our community. And it starts with us. It does. It starts with us. We have to be accountable to us and show up and be part of the conversation. So, Jason, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure. I could talk to you, for another couple of hours, but we don't have that kind of time. I am looking forward to seeing where this new journey takes you. I'm looking forward to being a part of this new journey with you, um, as part of the community, to help you build the change that you're looking for. So thank you so much for who you are, what you do, and being a change agent.
Nope, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right. You guys have a good night.